You can hear me. Hi everyone! It's so nice to see everyone here. I feel so blessed to be a part of this little movement we're having this evening. I would love to introduce you to our panelists, Adia Millett and Marianne Rose. And I just would like to ask them if you could maybe take a moment to tell us about yourself, your art, and your process a little bit.
You just pass this around. That's a good idea. Hi. Thank you guys for coming out tonight. It really means a lot. I know it wasn't the easiest journey for us to get here, and with all the conditions, it means a lot to be seen and. Oh, no, there. So a little bit about me. I'm a visual artist. I use any medium that seems appropriate. So paint, textiles and fabric, stained glass, video, drawing, collage, photography, sculpture, and have been practicing since 2000. And where do I start? There's so much, but the work that we're talking about this evening is more abstraction than representational work. But my abstraction specifically is really inspired by two things: by textile work, quilting. That even for the painting is really heavily embedded in the language and conversation around craft. And then also these days, stained glass is a big inspiration point. And we'll kind of get into the relationship to identity, but that's kind of a good starting point. I'm going to pass this on to you.
Okay, I guess one would say I have worn or do wear a variety of hats. Life is never simple, and I will be presenting both my own work and the art and the legacy of my late husband, Herbert Gentry, whose work I've been taking care of since he passed in 2003. And life is never like this. The artist lives a life on a tightrope, or that is my experience, that life is a tightrope, and you've got to keep working to keep the balance. One of the, where my work came from, I've pretty much, felt from the, I responded to people mostly in the early exposure as a child to impressionists and a little beyond, Mary Cassatt, and then pushing it onward. And I liked the abstraction that happened when you're moving onwards. And I remember copying in high school on a large piece of wood, a painting by Matisse, a still life, because I loved it. I wanted to get the feeling. And I announced that, no, I'm not going to keep playing violin and major in music. I am going to be an artist and major in art. My parents didn't stop me. And so I went to Berkeley and was exposed to abstract art. That was really the core, I would say, of that particular faculty at that time, inspired by Hans Hofmann, the artist. Onward and onward, I got studios, I got exhibitions, and I was, you can see in different works, there's probably 3 or 4 decades of individual pieces that show up on there. And one of the things that I saw a similarity to Joe Overstreet is I had shaped canvases, flat on the wall. So I felt that. And I started doing those when I went and lived in Paris. I'd gotten more to be there. And but I'd been exposed. That was a period then. and then, because I'd started on stretching. So it's exploration all through the years, shifting attitudes to color, attitudes to gesso or no gesso, all of those things. So.
I forgot you had a microphone for a second.
I thought that was sweet.
Also, I just want to share with you, I'm really enjoying absorbing these two women and all that they have to offer, especially as a young artist. But I would really love to get into boxes. So let me see if I can pull that up really quick. I am not very good with technology, so I'll try my best.
You were there.
I was.
Go back. That's
Boxes. Okay, so this piece is actually in the gallery currently. This is part of Joe Overstreet's flight series where he is transforming and transmuting the idea of a portrait. So taking what usually is very figurative, very two-dimensional, very flat, and then transposing it into something that now has become a three-dimensional abstract piece of art. So I was just wondering, what were your initial responses to this piece, and how did it impact you? What imprints did you take from this work?
See if that, it works great. That specific piece, I saw a piece, I don't know if it was that exact one, but one very close to that at Soul of the Nation, which was an exhibition of African American artists. I would say probably 2017 I saw it. And what really got me with that piece was that he would, I think for artists, when you walk into certain shows, you have these moments with pieces where you feel like the artist is specifically talking to you. And maybe not even as an artist, as anyone, where you feel like there's a conversation across time. And it can happen, I think, with musicians or, film where you just see, wow, this is addressing all the questions that I've been trying to find answers to. And that was one of the pieces where I was interested in painting, but I also wanted to push the boundaries of painting. I wanted the viewer, myself, to have a physical, spatial relationship to it. And all that at the same time, being a Black artist, are we responsible for talking about Blackness, talking about our experience and our identity? And it was pieces and artists like him that will continue to give us inspiration to be liberated from any confined ideas of what that conversation is built upon. So I'm gonna stop there.
So one of the things, Herb's work was never totally considered abstract because I see a figure, but is abstraction the absence of figures, or do you abstract from reality? Because those figures and what you think is ahead and this and that, and that's why Herb said once, it's not just my hands making the painting, it's the hands of my ancestors as well. He felt that touch from the past and from his African roots, all of that. So he was speaking to an element of feeling past history and experience. He also spoke a lot about how your everyday activity keeps shaping you and what you do in your art and not in your art, but that's part of it. And so the accusations that people thought he was living in Europe, ignoring what was going on, et cetera, were totally absurd. But that was, just a way of keeping him as an outsider to the community he was a part of. He grew up in Harlem. He was, but I don't know why. So I'm just saying that travel is essential, and Joe Overstreet did the travel also. He had it as a young person. He didn't stay in one place for his whole life, but the father and the family moved different times. Then they were in, like Oregon or Washington State, came down to California. I saw my first work by Joe Overstreet back at a show in 1970 at the Berkeley Art Center, and was inspired a bit by it. I thought it was great. It was really interesting. I didn't meet the artist. I just went in on an afternoon. I returned from my year at UC Santa Cruz, and I returned to start graduate school. And, I was running around and picking up the pieces of what's happening in Berkeley now. And, it was just so strange that I should meet him years later in New York. I mean, it's all connected on a kind of a migration. There are those, I have a African friend named Bajabril Ingawa, who is an immigrant from Mauritania. And, he was explaining, or you start seeing that there are people who migrate. It may be over a year's time, making movement, and there are those that stay in place. And so it may be that you have to take the cattle along with the weather and keep moving and then come back. And the other people have to stay in one place and work on the farm with what they're doing there. So there's reasons for it, but the attitudes deviate a bit. So if you need to be running around, it doesn't mean that people in one place who have fought hard for their identity and position in one place are going to respond. That's all.
Absolutely, and that's beautiful. And we've kind of been having conversations about how, art is not just a conversation we're having with our audiences now.
No.
It's a conversation we're having between artists, between generations,
Yes.
and that we can continue having. I thought it was also really beautiful that you kind of touched base on how it's like a touch from our ancestors. This flight series is really incredible, and I love how you both kind of pointed out your personal experiences that you've had with Overstreet's work, almost like it was a conversation that you've had with him. That's beautiful.
Can I just
Yes.
add that the one
Absolutely.
piece of his that you added today,
Yes.
it's kind of an interesting little side note.
No,
Not this one.
Oh,
you
not
added.
this one.
her ones.
Yeah.
Can you get to that? Yeah.
Let me see.
So when I was on my way out here, coming from San Francisco yesterday morning.
Sorry.
Yesterday
I saw
morning.
Forgive me.
Go forward one.
Go back or forward. Forgive me.
Oh,
Here, this one right here. I was on my way to the airport, and I decided to park my car at the airport, and I get out of my car, and I'm going in the tunnel that takes you into the airport. And as soon as I walk in, can we go back?
Yes.
I see this, and I look at the sign, and it's Joe's work. What are the chances that of all the art that I entered the airport to, his work there, and there's a photo of him just
and what are you
looking at me.
do?
Right.
And I just thought, well, I think I'm really supposed to take this trip.
Yes. It's a great flag.
And so when we talk about our ancestors, or about, oftentimes artists talk about kind of feeling like mediums, like that they're not, they don't even know, we sometimes don't completely understand where the art comes from. They might have a whole plan, and the plan gets deviated by some kind of unconscious inspiration. And so I think that as that was happening, it does something to me, which has happened with other artists like James Baldwin, where my work becomes influenced by that. So this might be a starting point where I start to investigate more into what Joe's work has done and start to build more of a conversation.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, like you might do that with activists or people, women leaders of our past, where you start to investigate them and they become an inspiration for your art.
Yeah. So actually I did that. So in ArtFest 2020, 21, I was a sponsored muralist for their shipping container project that they did every year. So my shipping container, like the mural that I have in the Vine neighborhood, which depicts like 94 victims of police brutality using symbols to tell the story of their lives. I did that with affluent Black women over time. And so I had a collection of successful Black women and also how they lived within visual symbols. So I think it's so interesting you would say that. I think that we've kind of been talking a little bit about identity from within the abstractions, from within the personal style of the many artists that we've talked to and you ladies yourselves. I would love to ask you, how can you speak to the ways in which form can convey an artist's identity and personality? How do you think about form in your own work, the concept of form?
Tricky question because my works are flat. I mean, they're paintings and they're flat on the wall. And so any bit of form comes in illusion. And we all bring that illusion in looking, and no one sees a painting the same way. It's an individual acceptance or rejection or exploration in each piece. So, form.
Well, I think you just nailed it.
Yeah.
Identity is the same way, right? We can do everything to create an idea of who we are, but everyone who sees us is going to project their own experience onto us. And I know for me, when I'm making abstract art, there may be a form that could be suggestive of a landscape or of a structure, but really it's just shapes. It's, and I think that that's true of the makeup of who we are. We all come with history, but not everyone knows all of our history. And we can make assumptions that all people under this specific identity quality, make up all of these these parts, but in fact, it is a projection. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about abstraction in that parallel, that an analogy between the two. Like this piece right here, this last piece, it really is pretty abstract, but if you look long enough, you could find the shape of a snake in there. You could,
Yes.
and I think for me, it's really just a collection of shapes. I love going back to that kind of simple notion.
Seeking lands. I think for some reason, Marx often suggests landscape. And, and whether we've got edges, if it's shapes, which the edge is one color versus another, basically, but it's still a touch,
Yes. Beautiful.
Hello? There we go. So I think that a lot of identity kind of comes from where we come from. It comes from our home and maybe the places that are home. Those could be geographic locations or they could be people that feel like home. So my question is there any piece of artwork that is either your work or work from somebody who inspires you that feels like home to you?
Oh. I have art all over the place in my 400 square feet. I've created ways of having little shelves that I can put smaller works. And I get inspired by people I've met over the years in the different countries that I've lived in. And, I've got a little Ed Clark, I've got a little Hamid Abdallah. I have other works that I never get to live with because it's so small and everything's in storage with my husband's work. I have some of his works. I have a tiny little portrait that the artist Buford Delaney did of my husband. I see it every day. You understand, it's, and some other artists who I always thought of myself as the art rescuer because it wasn't like I was paying big money for art. But I would see a piece by someone I knew that it shouldn't be going for that kind of money. And then I was also doing it with a lot of the Black artists that were my husband's friends over the years in Europe, because they didn't recognize it in Europe, and somebody dies and it just goes to a little auction house, and if you want it, you can have it, under $50, it's yours, you know, so who knew you could get beautiful art so cheap, right? But you have to be inspired to do that, you know, and you have to take a few chances. As a young person, I thought that only wealthy people could do that. Guess what? It wasn't true. You could just be creative and research and get things, and that was something neat. And when you talk about home, you know, where our identities come out of the house. My dad had 2 paintings he must have bought. He was out of World War II, out of the Army, so he might have had a little extra cash, but he bought 2 paintings, and so we have 2 real paintings from an artist from Marin County, not anybody famous. One was the interior of a cabin, it's very gray, but there was a box of tile. So he must have bought these pieces in the late 40s, mid to late 40s. And then there was another which I loved because it was a landscape of San Francisco, a hill with houses going up the hill, and we all know that, you know, there are artists that have thrived on that. You know, they were more realistic, but they were mysterious to me, and I would look at them as a kid. Just, you know, have art for your kids. That's
Beautiful.
Yeah, I agree with that. Art that feels like home, you know, it's funny because when I think of just thinking about what feels like home, I often think about being outside, being outdoors. And I think that becomes my starting point oftentimes when I'm thinking about making art, is being out. I spend time outside. That's where I feel most grounded, that's where I feel most connected to the planet. And that's what I try to take back when I'm creating art. Take that back into space. So to me, I think, you know, someone who's not lived in one place for that long, you start to feel like either everything is temporary or you have to find home within yourself, you know? So I love her expressions. I'm talking to her because she has just great expressions. No, but so for me, that's art. That's the real art, is because everything is unique. And there's so many incredible patterns in nature, that if there's any major inspiration, if there's any place that I would imagine coming out of and going back to eventually, that's home. Yeah.
What a beautiful life, you know, to find home in anywhere that you go. That's incredible. That just moved me a little bit. So we are 3 female artists from 3 different generations, it seems. And correct me if I'm wrong. You know?
No.
But
What do you mean? I'm 25.
right, I know. We went to college together. It's fine. But I noticed that futurism is a hot topic in the arts today, and as we are, and I'll explain further, but like as we are 3 different generations of artists, and we're leaving, like you said, we're leaving conversations for the next artist to pick up on. I was wondering, like, how do we balance building for the future while also remembering and honoring our pasts? So those conversations that we're having between different artists with our art, and also in conversations and discussions like this, how do we acknowledge what has happened, and how do we make room for innovation in the future, and creatively preserve those memories and that nostalgia? Take your time.
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think on a kind of side note, kind of geeking out, I'm a big Octavia Butler fan.
Me too.
And so to me, it's almost like she's written in the future, you know, like she's way beyond time. And for me, jazz music does that too. I keep thinking it's going to take us another 100 years to actually understand jazz. You know, jazz from the 40s, 50s, 60s. And so I did an exhibition this past year in Hong Kong, and I asked writers who write about jazz to write a piece about a song and a musician that they really like. And I took that song and what they wrote and made a painting so that we could build that conversation with the hopes that sometime in the future, someone will take the painting and the song and the writing and create something else. So I think that's a way that we can kind of bridge the connection between time, between the creatives that are, as we continue to build.
Well, I find interesting the question of jazz because my husband's in a big group show, but they created a book for it, which is actually available before the show is available. And it was Americans in Paris. It's going to be, and what New York University's putting it together. But I saw they were doing this show, and I called up and said, listen, my husband is a great artist. You don't know him, probably, but he went to NYU for 2 years before he joined the Army, and he was studying business, but all the same, he went there, so you should come and look at it, And so they came over. I live at the Chelsea Hotel, so it wasn't so far for them to come. And they got turned on, and they said, okay. But then in the end, they created a chapter about Herbert Gentry. One of the 6 chapters was about my husband, and it was about the jazz life in Paris, because he had a jazz club for about 2.5 years, 49, 50, 51. And at that point, he was married to a jazz singer. And so a woman named Rashida Braggs, she teaches jazz music, writing, whatever, up in New England. And we got in connection. And so, they got the photos, they got Paris, they got the whole thing. But even Larry Rivers went to this club my husband had for those years, So it was quite a adventure. So yeah, we don't know the past, and we certainly don't know the future. We can project. I mean, our future, our past is like the painting you did yesterday. That's the past, And what's the present? Well, that was 2 seconds ago. That was walking in this room. The future, who knows? Just do the art.
Right.
I love that. We should put that on a shirt. Who knows the future? Just do the art. So I'm really excited to ask this question because I know that it will look a lot different from both of you and from just any kind of person that you could ask this question. So was there ever a moment that you had some epiphany, whether it was artistic or just in your life, that helped you better understand your identity or a shared identity, even as an artist? So was there ever like an aha moment where you were like, oh, this is who I am. I know me now a little bit better.
I'm sorry. They're tough questions.
No, I think those are questions might have asked when I was much younger. And, as time evolves, that question is like it almost doesn't matter. I am who I am. And that keeps changing. It's not a concrete, one place, one time person that I am. You always change. And you have to accept that, If you don't, you got problems.
I love that.
I think from an artist, I think there's so many different aspects of who we are and who our identity is. As an artist, I think it's hard to be humble and also believe in yourself enough to get up every day and say, I'm not going to do all the other side jobs, and I'm going to focus on the one thing I need to do. and to know that your voice actually does matter. So I think, even though I was a practicing artist, as soon as I got out of school, I think there was a part of me that lacked confidence and really, had been trained so much and learned how to be so self-critical that it probably wasn't until my early 40s that I kind of had that epiphany. It was like, it doesn't matter if I'm good or not, this is what I'm gonna do. Stop, I was teaching, I was doing counseling, I was doing all kinds of other jobs in addition to being an artist. I had left New York because it was New York.
Yeah.
And at that point, I just said, no, I'm not doing anything else. And I think it was good. I had to have that life experience of doubting myself and my abilities to get to a place where I made my voice, my creative voice, my priority.
Yes, beautiful.
That means a lot for me, like to hear, well, yeah, especially because it's that whole intergenerational, like phenomenon, right? Where you talk to an older artist and they say, you know what, you're gonna be maybe 4 or 5 different people in your life, and that's okay. And then also speaking to another artist of color, and just like, we do have those moments where, is this my identity that's being projected onto me via a stereotype or some sort of assumption, or is this my identity via I'm choosing me and I'm choosing this part of myself right now? So I have one more question for you. This is going to be Mary Ann's favorite question. Burnout is an experience that every artist can relate to. Sorry. And I mean this in terms of like creative block. We all have moments where whether it's you're doing an exhibition over and over, or you've all of a sudden you're creating all sorts of work, right? And then all of a sudden it just like you hit a wall and you don't know what to create anymore. Or maybe you're just not gaining the inspiration that you used to gain. My question for you is, do you, and if you do, how do you battle creative block or any type of personal disconnection or lack of inspiration in your work? And what challenges do you experience conveying your personal identity into your creations?
Well, I think I've had blocks, but they're different than blocks that I created for myself. And, it was Prometheus. You keep pushing the rock up the hill and it goes down and you say, and you go down there and you try to push it again. And so I'm in the middle of pushing so that I can get to the place that I had when I was starting out. With that freedom and everything, somebody always had your back, right? You had your parents, you had, a job. Yeah, you lucked into things because people gave you a break because you were young or something like that. And that was, a great time. But then, there comes a point stuff starts happening, and it's really difficult to remake yourself to other cultures' expectations, or when I had moved to New York to deal with the expense and then the responsibilities I had. And I had always thought, I'll get out of that, I won't have kids. Guess what? That wasn't the problem. Other things come in. You lose someone, you've got twice as many expenses, you've got to take care of a legacy forever. And how do you learn a whole new set of stuff? How do you do this? And it's all about finance, it's all about legals, all of that stuff. And so it's like you're pushing something up a different hill, and you just say, have faith. Have faith. That's all.
Thank you.
So I haven't thought about it in these terms, but listening to you makes me think about this idea of having the privilege to have writers or to have any kind of block, like maybe when you're so deep into a creative world, you don't have time to not be creative, or like you don't have the space. You have to be creative. I mean, I know for me, in times when I was doing other jobs or when I had other life things happening and I couldn't be creative, it really impacted my well-being. And it almost, I got to the point where it's like, I have to be making art. It's, it's life or death. And I think that you see that with a lot of artists, that their mental well-being is based on them being able to creatively express themselves. And so I think, I don't know, I kind of feel like if I had artists creative block, I would probably get a therapist. I would
Maybe
want
that's the answer.
something to be opened up, some aspect that is blocked to be unpacked.
Beautiful.
There actually are other avenues I've gone through, because you talk about having different avenues of exploration, they're part of your art. And I've done lots of writing, and sometimes I've had to shift into that and to negotiate through that all these past years. It's not like there is nothing coming out of me. Of course there is, but it was sort of, okay, I have to do this for this period. And I can't do the painting right now. It's, for these, there are reasons, but it doesn't mean that it's not on my mind and on my feeling. And maybe it comes out in the writing.
I love that concept that, we are all creative beings, one way or another, depending on what you do or who you are. There are different ways of creation. And maybe if it's not coming out in one well, that's because your body is telling you that it needs to come out in a different well. I'm learning a lot about yogic philosophy right now, and there's a lot about that the body never does anything that it isn't doing to protect itself and to care for itself. So maybe it's just politely asking, can you redirect your attention to different places? That's beautiful. How are we on time? Perfect.
You want to open it up to questions?
Yes, absolutely. So, thank you so much for answering my questions today, and thank you all for coming. And I would like to open up to the audience any questions that we may have for these incredible artists.
So, I'm so sorry.
No, you're good.
So you were talking about the notion of having this concept of identity that you hold for yourself, but this notion, especially for the artist of color, that there is something also pushing back on you. And I kept thinking about the notion of the intersectional and, what identity do I pick today? So how does that kind of, if you feel pressure, because again, I'm thrusting myself onto you, how did those kind of strictures and those kinds of spaces feel to you when you're thinking about your art and about creating?
Well, I don't know. It's interesting because I think I was trained during a time when postmodernism and art around identity was really becoming an important topic. So when you're trained to be invested, and when you see that most of the artists that I was learning in school, specifically Black artists, specifically Black women artists, that's the work that they were doing. And so they became my inspiration point. I was not being shown African-American abstract artists when I was in college in the 90s. So then you think, well, this is the start point, this is where I build from. And then I think that then it becomes our responsibility to ourselves to expand what it means to be who we are and to create what we want to create. I do think, I just heard this really great part of a talk that Rashid Johnson did, and he said one of the important things that he believes that Black artists have to do is that they have to see themselves as the center point rather than imagining that they are existing in a white environment and that they have to circle around that language and that conversation in order to be relevant. And so I think that that's kind of something that that can help alleviate the idea that my responsibility is to anyone but who I choose to be responsible to speak to and for.
Marianne, do you have any response to that question?
Regarding
Yeah.
Herb's attitude, he was who he was. He basically says, whatever is pushing on, what you experience. I think that's what he was talking about, experiences, right? He was, I know what it is to be a foreigner in countries, right? And then they have aspects of which is the best foreigner, and then there it's sort of like a qualification in there. And at that point, American was pretty positive, but it didn't mean that you were one of them. Still, so you're a bit of an outsider always. I'm working. They're doing a film on my husband. This fellow who we met when we moved up to Malmö, Sweden from Paris. His name was Matabuco Diakite, filmmaker, was what he had studied. He studied in New York because he grew up in Harlem, and his last name was Robinson then. But his mother married a fellow from Nigeria, and he joined them in Nigeria, probably high school era years and everything, and then went back, did some studies in America, and he ended up in Sweden. And he did films about, in the end, they wouldn't give him backing for any of his films and all, financial, because I only went to Swedes, even though he was living there pretty permanently and stuff like that. So he became a lawyer, a migration lawyer, and that's where his inspiration for doing these films came out. And I remember, I think it was 1982, he announced he wanted to do a film about my husband, and that was fine. He did all that footage, but he never got the backing to actually extend it into a whole film. Well, recently, last summer, June or May, they had a film showing of his migration films at the Maisley Brothers Theater up in Harlem, in Manhattan. And I didn't know about it till after, so I didn't go. But anyway, he was inspired. And Sweden responded to this, and so all of a sudden they're doing that, and they've got a Swede working who's a PhD student at NYU, and they've got people, so this film about my husband by Matabuco, who may be in the process of dying at the same time, unfortunately. This is all crazy, but it's all a fight. It's multiple identities. It's not, but what I learned, because there's a book about this that just came out fairly recently, but most families, the white families who may go in of different European, etc., origins and go to Sweden, which is considered very open as a country, by the second generation, those kids are Swedes. Nobody's given them any trouble. But among people with Black heritage, and mostly Africans, even at the third generation, they're still sort of outsiders. So these problems continue to exist. And so there is reaction against stuff. It doesn't mean you can't have success. Matabuco's son, who had a white mother, he ended up being a superstar in the 80s, 90s, hip hop. Whenever hip hop happened, he's a Swedish hip hop superstar. And, which was great, but he backs his father in some of this stuff. But he's totally conscious of what these issues are there. So I think that things shift around a lot. And also there's a cultural thing that goes on, because you have to change to be their culture, and maybe you can't. And I'm very good friends with Joe Overstreet's widow, and I run these problems, and she was telling me, no, Joe, you should read about cargo cults. And I said, what on earth are cargo cults? And I looked it up and found a long thing, and I've read it once, and I would have read it 20 times to try to figure a little better. But what was happening in the Pacific, when the ships were coming to different islands, they were bringing goods, and how in the Pacific Islands, they were, their religious belief went to this kind of thing where the new goods and new wealth were coming in, and it shifted who they thought was important and what they thought was important. So I'm not saying I know about this whole philosophy, but it's very interesting because it deals with how cultural changes come about by the impact of what was previously unknown and unexperienced. And she thought that was totally Joe.
Absolutely, and when we're talking about works like boxes, we're talking about, how cultures shift, how, one day it is, we're being welcoming, we're creating, affirmative action policies, we're creating, institutional change, and then something can happen, and all of that hard work can be derailed in a day. And that goes with art as well.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yes.
I have two questions, but I'm only gonna ask one. We're talking about identity, but you all are using a very universal language, geometry. Joe's work was strongly rooted in the geometric language. Adia, your work seems to have a strong relationship to geometry, squares, triangles, polygonal shapes, and you too, Marianne, a lot of curvilinear lines, and Herbert Gentry, the circle seemed to be his go-to. So
The organic, yeah.
Yeah, so talk a little bit about what these geometries mean to you and what you feel like you are expressing through these geometric forms, because you're talking a lot about identity, but the language that you're using is quite broad. You talked about being rooted and centered in nature and natural forms, so maybe you can shed a little light on that for us.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably a few starting points for how my work became so geometrical and so kind of straight lined. One is that my earlier work was mainly miniatures and structural spaces. So I used to build these doll houses and talk about home and kind of identity around that. And so at some point when I started to shift my relationship to how I thought about identity, the structure started to come apart, and to the point where it was just a flat shape, a flat facade of a structure. And as I started to do that, I kept thinking, how do we talk about dismantling things, taking things apart to create something new? So that was kind of the basis of a lot of the earlier work. So the piece that you have of mine downstairs was kind of at the beginning of that painting form, where the structure had come apart. It's kind of this explosion of shapes that almost look a little bit 3D, but are starting to flatten out. The other component for that, for me with the shapes, is a big inspiration of mine was G's bin. So I saw these quilts, and it took me to a history that felt so familiar, but also distant for a lot of African Americans. We have a connection to another continent that we don't necessarily know all of those connections to, and that those quilts really helped me to start to see the hands, to see the songs that were sung, the community that was based upon those pieces, the materials that were literally old fabric. So there was a history in it, but it also was this beautiful, minimal work of art, each one of these quilts. So even though these are shapes in the paintings and they are very abstract in some way, personally they have history. And that's why going back to that idea that the viewer comes in with a whole different history. They don't know all that. Sometimes you can read a text, but my thought is you're going to come in with maybe a relationship to a different set of quilt from a different place on the planet, and be able to now identify a little bit more with my experience, hopefully, or with other artists' experience.
Or the human experience, period. You know, we're out of one thing in the beginning. So I don't know really how to respond. I think Herb would say, when I was trying to think how to answer this, but if you work in the subconscious, you aren't giving concrete terminology to what you're doing until later, right? And so that's, you know, you let go, it's your physical response. I tried to, in my set of paintings that I did back before I went to Paris, I started with mark making, basically, and it was like alternate fields that these marks would go on and build and build and build. I might use 2 or 3 colors. And, you know, they came together. Which was a mysterious kind of result for me, but it wasn't thinking about a quilt, although I did make a quilt, give me some material. Back in that time, I had a sewing machine, I put it together and make a quilt, okay? But, it's the feeling, and that's what her voice said, it's the feeling.
It's beautiful how like art can make you feel a certain way, and I definitely get that history from both of your works, and especially your quilt series, where I almost feel like there's some candomblé inspiration from like West African tradition as well.
We have time for one?
Okay, can we get one more question from the audience? It's okay if not, no pressure.
I'll go with no one else.
Oh, she gets her second.
Okay, so my second question is, Joe Overstreet, Herbert Gentry, that whole generation of artists was really focused on pushing the boundaries of art, pushing outside of any previous limitations that had been established to define what is a great painting, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable. And there are points when every artist has to push themselves, beyond their own boundaries or limitations. So I guess this question would be for the 3 of you, including you, Maya, what work of art that you've created that you think challenged you or forced you to push beyond, your own perceived boundaries or limitations in order to create something that you wanted to create?
I'm gonna let you go first.
I would have had to look and respond to my own works to have that as a conscious concept. So I have a hard time answering that.
I think there's 2 pieces that I think about. So when I was in college, I painted, because that's what a lot of people do in college and art school. And then I stopped and started doing a lot more, used a lot of other materials. It was only in 2016 I had a dream about a painting that a friend of mine, Noah Davis, who's no longer with us, who started the Underground Museum in LA, he was in my dream, and he had done this painting and was talking to me about it, and I said, I have to make a painting. And that was the beginning of me starting to paint. And as someone who had been doing all these other materials, it was a huge risk, because you get known for doing something, and then all of a sudden, you show up and someone who's just shown your work before is like, oh, okay, we're doing this now. And I think the other thing that felt like kind of a shift and a change for me was working with a material that I didn't know how to work with, which I've done a few times, but with stained glass, I didn't technically have the skills and had to actually have fabricators help me. And as a crafter, I think of myself as a crafter more than an artist. It's hard for me to have other people do things for me. I know a lot of my peers who are very successful artists don't make most of their work. They come up with the ideas and they hire other people to do it. And I have been very adamant about not being one of those artists. And when it gets to a point where I want to do something big and out of a material that I'm not familiar with, you have to ask for help. And it started this whole new process for me where I could collaborate with other artists to do the things that I wasn't capable of doing on my own. So that was a big thing. Besides, when I cut myself, which you do with glass, I faint. And this has happened to me before, so I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna be cutting glass on my own. So it's kind of,
Thank you.
Well, I think actually you're right, because shifting the medium makes a difference. And because you can't do exactly what you do in painting, you can't do in printmaking, in etching.
yes.
Right, and that, I spent a lot of time at Bob Blackburn's studio and made prints back in the day and stuff. And it was social in a way painting wasn't. In painting, you go by yourself. In printmaking, or at least at Bob Blackburn's, you're all working at different things at the same time in the same studio, and it wasn't till, if you're gonna pay somebody to print stuff for you, you'd be in that, or in a special room, or if you're doing monoprints, which was like painting, but quick, you do it in that room. But you're right about that, the challenge of shifting.
Yeah, just before you answer, I just want to say, I think that if you're an artist, a young artist, and you're hearing this, you have a cheat sheet, you can do this stuff. You don't have to wait until you're, in your 30s, 40s, 50s to figure it out. Take those examples and run with it.
Okay, so I asked all of these questions then. So I was like, selfishly, I was like, I want to know. I want to know the path, and these are some questions we have to all ask, and that our older generations have to ask themselves in order to, follow their own journey. And it has been so incredible to witness, both of you. What I would say to answer your question, I would say the faces piece in the Vine neighborhood. So I created a depiction of 94 faces of police and mob brutality and violence. There's only one surviving person that I took, or that I did their portrait on that piece, and there are over 94 faces. And so the Vine Neighborhood Association here in Kalamazoo reached out to me and basically wanted to create a mural, and they had known that I had been reaching out to everybody in town. This is when I first came to Kalamazoo, and I was not the lady you see right now. But I was reaching out to everyone. How can I make art? Can I make a mural? I really want to make a mural. And so the My Neighborhood Association gave me that opportunity. They said, we have a piece that'll be 25 feet by 10 feet, and you get to choose what you make. And I had never had that before from a commission where the person commissioning it was like, nope, it's whatever you want. And I'm like, are you serious? Anything? And they're like, yeah. So it was during the George Floyd summer, and I was teaming up with a lot of different activist student movements around town, one of which was the George Floyd protest that we organized together. And so I was thinking about okay, we're always saying say their names, but how do I make people see their faces when they say their names? And so the whole concept of faces, and that became Faces Part 1, right? So there was Faces Part 1 with the victims of mob brutality, and then it became Faces Part 2, which we were talking about, where I depicted Black women and their achievements, and then there's Faces Part 3, which is going to be featured in Out Front Pride this year. That's all LGBTQIA, Black, and Indigenous people, and how they lived and their portraits. So I think that breaking up how people lived into symbols was really intense for me, and it was that one moment where I acknowledged, like, okay, I'm a writer too, right? How do I turn my art into writing? And so through those symbols that are on all of those faces, you know, the pentagram is like somebody who was serving in the armed services when they were murdered by the police. You know, the rainbow that was an LGBTQIA person who was murdered by police or mob brutality. So it was really powerful for me to see how, you know, I could transcribe one medium into another. I just want to say I adore you. I adore both of you so much, and it is a complete honor to be on this stage with you and to have the opportunity to just share this discussion and to learn and absorb from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really so wonderful to see how inspired and how happy you are, and your questions were great, and just I'm excited for your future. Really.
Thank you.
Well, I also just like having this is like we're in the cafe.
Yeah.
And we're talking about art, and how often is that done in front of an audience? I mean, you've got an audience that's not listening to you at their own tables talking away,
Right.
but welcome to Paris, right?
And a big thanks to the KIA for having us all
Yes,
here.
thank
We
you.
love you, we appreciate you. Thank you all for coming. This is awesome.